I thought I might talk a little bit about the beginning of the Science Studies unit, but a lot of it is in that newsletter that I hope you've all got a copy of. So my thoughts have been going back a little bit further about David's roots, and I'd like to propose that you should consider John Wesley as one of the founder members, or the founding fathers, of the Science Studies unit. John Wesley and his brother Charles grew up in a Lincolnshire rectory. They went to Oxford and were ordained and started off as ministers, but they became dissatisfied with the way things were going. George Whitefield was taking up outdoor preaching, which was considered not the thing at all. Not sure it wasn't even illegal. And so John Wesley began, among other things in his life, to go around preaching to coal miners in Bristol, tin miners in Cornwall, all around Britain. He started his lifetime of travelling around Britain on a horse, thousands of miles. And as he gathered more and more people began to call themselves Methodists, he organised them. He organised them into classes of about 10 to 12 people with a class leader, and they were responsible for each other, to support each other through thick and thin and work together. And then the whole church, he organised that there is a conference every year, leadership changes each year, and decisions are made on a democratic basis, whereas the Church of England was hierarchical with bishops and all the rest. And David's families on both sides had long Methodist histories. David's father graduated as a chemist just before the First World War. He went to Berlin to perfect his German and then was interned in Berlin for the whole of the First World War. So he survived. His younger brother was killed in March 18. He then became a chemist in the paper industry, the first fully qualified chemist in the paper industry, married a musician, and they were then transported from Buckinghamshire to Aberdeen, which is where David grew up, and he loved it. He was then, however, quite early sent off to the Methodist public school, which was evacuated to the Athol Palace Hotel in Pitlochry, which was cold and barn-like in the war. But he had a very charismatic scout leader, so he didn't join the OTC. He joined the Scouts and enjoyed the countryside, working together in patrols. So leadership and the manner of leadership was grown in him from an early stage in this format of small groups, and I think you might see the parallels for the Science Studies unit. He did radio astronomy in the days when it was, his apparatus was just sticks on the ground with wires through it. It was before the big science stage. Bernard Lovell was having to raise thousands and thousands to build Jodrell Bank. It wasn't till later that Martin Ryle in Cambridge had to start raising money to build Lord's Bridge. And again, there was a very different style of leadership. Martin Ryle was very close to he had shoe boxes. If there were visitors to his office, he would turn the shoe boxes round so the labels wouldn't show, that kind of thing, which then David and Mike Mulcahy wrote about in Astronomy Transformed. David then, he'd written up his thesis. He was teaching in a local school. This offer of a job in BBC came along, which he really relished. The BBC, at that time, the Home Service and the Third Programme, all the producers, there were poets and philosophers and a couple of scientists, people of all disciplines who all met every week and all discussed everything and all shared ideas. It was like a, I don't know, college common room maybe. And David could do, he didn't just have to do science things. He could do Calypso for Christmas Day, or produce Dame Flora Robson for this week's appeal, or whatever. Many things came his way, and he loved that for 6 years. But then this idea of the Science Studies Unit was floated, and this was Scotland. There wasn't any question, let alone what Science Studies Unit was going to be. They started in Victoria Place, but in one of the attic rooms on the south side. He and Corinne, who was somebody from the Air Force, she'd been an administrator, very competent, very able, and the two of them got the thing going until, as you've heard, four people came and joined the team, and the unit actually got going. But the gestation was really quite a long period. So finally, it really got going probably in '67. But it's been great to enjoy 50 years recollections with you all and meet lots of people from the past. Thank you for having me.
It's fabulous to be associated with the history of the Science Studies Unit, especially in its glory years, as I think of them. And the glory years were 1976 to 1984, which by a strange coincidence is the period of time when I was in Edinburgh. I was very lucky in that respect. I'm not very interestingly diverse bunch of presentations so far. I obviously hadn't very clearly understood what this session was about. I did ask in advance, and the answer was, well, it'll start off by Brian giving an account of the Science Studies Unit's contributions. Doesn't say contributions to what, but I mean, I, as usual, took this quite seriously, and I tried to think, you know, what difference has the unit made in the world? Of course, I feel totally stupid trying to answer that question, since Barry Barnes and David Bloor have already brilliantly debunked the idea of giving commemorative recollections of anything, but I'm stuck with these few notes that I've got. For me, the great thing about the Science Studies Unit, all of these things have been touched on in one way or another. The great thing about it was, of course, the strong program. In the sociology of scientific knowledge, when I try and think of what the strong program was, I don't actually think about the symmetry postulate for some reason. I think about a variant of that, which is especially David Bloor's idea that we have what science studies is supposed to do is identify the social causes of scientific beliefs. That is tenet number 1, I think, of the strong program on page 4 of David's book. I make students read this, and then I say, can you find a social cause somewhere in the literature? It's not so easy to do. Like many things that have to do with the Science Studies Unit, the important thing here is a kind of an opening up of a space for questions, the opening up of a problematic. Once you ask people to look for the social causes of scientific beliefs, there's a whole field of arguments that come into play. And that, I think, was the great strength of the unit. Not that it's always been on the right side of these arguments, if you ask me, but just opening up these problematics. The old social causes of scientific beliefs led straight into the science wars. You know, it might be interesting to think about the way that the unit has provoked scientists into rather vicious arguments mainly in the States, perhaps, not so well remembered in Britain, but they were a big thing in the world with a lot of consequences. The one thing that I always try to hang on to about the strong program wasn't this point about the social causes of beliefs, but the way that the possibility of some kind of social cause, say, for a particular belief was developed. And I mean the philosophy called finitism. I think finitism was probably the most beautiful construction of the science studies unit. And it doesn't get mentioned so much in that fashion. I associate finitism with an idea of open-endedness. It starts off as an idea about classification. We only have a finite number of examples of ducks, people, tables. Therefore, what's going to count as the next one is kind of open-endedly determinable. But the whole idea that everything about science, or indeed life and the world in general, is open-ended. Nothing is determined in advance. Everything is becoming. Is an incredibly important and powerful idea, I think. The official unit line was, having established this openness, to immediately close it down again. So you have a classification as open-ended business. How can we know what cats and dogs are? Well, we appeal to the social. Something social is closing down the open-endedness of the becoming. I don't find that very convincing. From my point of view, it led into studies of controversy and scientific practice and processes of slowly closing things down, interactive stabilization, mangling and stuff like that, which seems to be a very rich angle to develop these insights from. From another angle, one of the most interesting problems that the unit opened up has to be realism. Just how are we going to think about the world that we live in? How should we think about the entities that make it up? Most of us are naive realists, I think. I certainly was when I came to the unit as a kind of ex-physicist. Again, if you follow the doctrine of the unit, there is no problem of realism. Everything is socially constructed. To go from one extreme to another. That, of course, lies behind the dreaded science wars, I think. Scientists think they're finding out actually what's in the world, and the strong program answer is social construction, of course. This is the problematic that's coming back over the last few years in STS as the so-called ontological term, which I think science studies still finds kind of hard to negotiate. The one other thing that occurred to me to mention, I was thinking of, great books from the science studies unit, historically. One of them is certainly Steve Shapin and Simon Schaffer's Leviathan and the Air Pump. A book, this is what interests me, a book that was, popularized and made important by Bruno Latour in a very kind of paradoxical way. I mean, I remember Latour, what was his argument? Oh, his argument was he wanted to get Leviathan and the Air Pump translated into French, and the only way you could do that was to write a book himself, which is, We Have Never Been Modern, where he does this interesting operation on Leviathan and the Air Pump. And he says, this shows you the simultaneous construction of the dualist human, non-human divide. And that leads into all the non-human, non-modern actor network theory. And it just struck me that this was kind of an interesting paradox that we might want to dwell upon a bit, in the sense that I'm not sure that the Science Studies unit ever got to grips with Bruno Latour and actor network theory. I don't think Chapin did, for a start. Yeah, that's all I could think of saying. Thank you.
I wanted to just pick up a number of, and add to a number of Brian's points. He more or less said everything I would have said one way or another. But I want to say, because when I came into Edinburgh through the unit that Robin was heading up, it was to set up a postgraduate programme. So teaching was always my primary concern, really, in this institution. And I want to say something really positive about the undergraduate programme that the Science Studies Unit won. It was their kind of meal ticket, yes, to being in the university, certainly. But programmes like that one, and certainly that one, were a pathway for many people of Brian's generation, mine, and a bit younger, from the natural sciences and sometimes engineering into social science, and in particular into science and technology studies. And we should never underestimate how valuable that pathway continues to be across a number of institutions, and there should still be more such undergraduate programmes. So that would be my first comments. That's something I would take to the future and view it as not just a meal ticket, actually. Moving on to the postgraduate side, which I had responsibility for, not for the unit initially, but we straddled them in the end. When I moved into the unit, I guess we put the two programmes together, and I hope that was positive. But, you know, even before I did that straddling between the kind of technology studies side of Edinburgh and the science studies side, the people who were doing PhDs in the Science Studies unit up to then were incredibly broad, and it included many programmes on technology. It even included a few feminist contributions. I'm thinking, not so much on the feminist side, but two of the postdocs that started in the Information Communication Technology programme, who had done their PhDs in the Science Studies unit. One was Eloina Pelaez from Mexico, who had talked about the software crisis, really pioneering work at the time. And another was Alfonso Molina. I don't know if he's here. He had to go back. Who used some of that sort of constructivist strand from the Strong programme to think about how people trying to build a technological field operate. So it was in the same way trying to do an internalist thing on a very externally located activity. And I want to give credit to David also for something that's not been mentioned, is just what a fabulous information channeler David was. And Moira also continued that work in the PICT programme. I was forever, and I was not the only one, waking up, going to my pigeonhole of a morning to find a little stack of cuttings very neatly trimmed about topics which he deemed that I would be interested in, and of course I was. And he knew the topics that would be meaningful to all of his colleagues, and he made sure that they heard and saw photocopies of whatever was relevant in the day or the week or the month's press there. I do agree with Brian when he says that the Strong programme and the work in the Science Studies unit opened up an intellectual space that crossed many disciplines and that contributed at least to that constructivist quiet revolution, perhaps in the social sciences. And also that although the unit eschewed a more direct sort of political engagement, members of the unit did in those earlier days, that nonetheless those wider movements picked it up and ran with it in various ways that were perhaps not anticipated or always welcome, but ran with it. So I was active along with Robin and others in the radical science movement of the 70s, and then in feminist work on science and technologies into the 80s, which Anna's been a part of. So you only have to look at some of the interesting debates in the 80s about feminist epistemology of science to see another take on the Strong programme. And I think what that leaves me with, and this will be no surprise to everyone who knows me well, is some sense of our wider field as a very rich tapestry. I have a passion about Scottish tweeds. And if you look at Scottish tweeds, every yarn, if you look at it under a small magnifying glass, every yarn has many unexpected colours spun within it. And of course, all of the tweeds have many different yarns spun together in different patterns. I think that's a lovely metaphor, actually, for our field. It's a nice way to end it, isn't it? Oh, I have one more. Do have one more comment, which is that I did come to the unit. I was very much welcomed into the unit, but I felt intellectually an outsider because of that sort of thing that we do science, and I was part of the other group doing technology. But I never felt unwelcome as an individual. I might have felt intellectually somewhat out on a limb at times within that family, but it was a family. I always felt very warmly welcomed, very cared for, and very respected. And over the course of one's career, there are times when all those things really count, and I want to just say thank you to my colleagues.
Something of an imposter, not only because I've missed a lot of the initial talk, so I don't quite know what was said, but also because I am, like Wendy, have come to the Science Studies unit from, well, for a slightly odd direction, and then obviously being part of other kinds of trends and intellectual discussions also. But when thinking about what to say, I thought I should think about this sort of preponderance of turns in science and technology studies. We're always having turns these days. I think we're on a materialist one, or maybe not. Maybe we've gone past that. But rather than trying to address those, I thought I could talk about how the Science Studies unit has been really important in some of the main turning points in my life, really, if that's not too sort of grandiose and self-indulgent. So the first thing to say, and this very much echoes what Wendy was saying, is that as a young graduate just out of an applied physics degree at the University of Strathclyde, sitting in my grubby little flats, wondering what on earth I was going to do with the rest of my life, I took 3 phone calls. One was to offer me a place doing a PhD at Strathclyde on optical physics, which I didn't really think I could stomach, to be honest with you. The second one was to interview for a job in the Scottish Borders looking after windmills. And again, I thought that might be rather dangerous for the windmills and the other engineers involved in that. And the third was from Wendy, who was responding to a letter that I had written about my interest in the social aspects of science, and particularly in relation to gender, to offer me a place that had come up on the Technology Studies Masters. And that was a massive turning point for me, intellectually and sort of personally, really, because it was a space where I could come and pursue those questions that I had, all running all the way through my degree, about what about the social context of this knowledge. What about the political, the value-based decisions? How do we know these theorems and these hypotheses are real? And that was hugely important for me. I don't know where else I could really have done that at the time, certainly in Scotland, but even beyond Scotland. So that was massively important. So I came, I did my MSc, I went on, did my PhD, and then began working in Edinburgh, and in this wider kind of diaspora of people who have kind of issues around, or were exploring issues around the social aspects of science. And that was with Sarah Cunningham-Burley in the public health sciences in the medical school. And the second turning point for me was when I was able to work with colleagues in the unit, Steve Sturdy in particular, to develop a fellowship application for the Wellcome Trust to do some history of medicine work on cystic fibrosis as a disease category and how it had been formed. So slightly more edging towards some of the more sort of traditional terrain of science studies than the topic of my PhD. And that was successful, and I was able to move to the Science Studies unit to do that work. And again, that's been so important to me. That was my first sort of foray into being an independent scholar, and there was a home for me to do that in Edinburgh, and to work with lots of people around the institution, not just in the unit, to develop and explore those ideas further. And the third turning point for me is a personal one, really. And again, I think this is about the institutional and organisational spaces where you can do this kind of work, but it's also about meeting other people and you know, building a life around those people. And I met my husband here. And I actually discovered that I was expecting my first child in the loo in the Science Studies unit because I did a pregnancy test there. So that's when I think about the Science Studies unit. I think about that loo. But it's important, I think, that you know, people's lives really have been shaped by those kinds of the fact that there was a Science Studies unit, the fact that you could meet like-minded people who were interested in those kinds of questions, and it has been very fundamental to my life. And I think there's probably a lot of people around the room and people who are not here today who also probably have that sense of engagement with the intellectual, the organisational and the personal kind of trajectories around the Science Studies unit. So, thank you.
I have a really bad memory, and perhaps I'm like Barry in that regard. I don't really remember too much of what happened half a century ago. I do know, however, that I came to the Science Studies unit, I think only 2 or 3 months after Barry and David, as the PhD student. No, I mean that. It was a very small group, and it turned out to be a really exciting group. And the first thing I briefly want to say is that it's very hard in retrospect to convey the sense of excitement and novelty that was being created in the Science Studies unit and in a handful of other places, including Bath, in those particular years. The sociology of scientific knowledge had not been invented. It was invented in, I don't know, a 5-year period by 5 or 10 people. And that was incredibly exciting, just incredibly exciting. And, you know, one has to go back there and remember that they didn't know about the sociology of scientific knowledge to recreate that excitement. So that's the first thing I want to say. The space then was an opening. It was a place where people, you've heard some of them talk, people were creating a possibility, exploring something, trying to see what they could bring into being. A second thing I learned just from listening, of course, is that there are generations. This is obvious, but it hadn't really quite struck me. There are generations of Science Studies units. There are some continuities. I think David has been with the Science Studies unit throughout its entire time. But clearly, hearing you talk, different people have come with different concerns, different agendas, different backgrounds, and have made subtly, or in some cases not so subtly, different things out of what the Science Studies unit was able to offer them. Andy is, of course, wrong. The glory years of the Science Studies unit were 1967 to 1972, for reasons which I won't go into. Those were particularly important. Now, I think probably a bit like Andy, can't see him, here he is. I have sort of in a way moved on intellectually, and I've done sort of rather different things during most of my career. But I just wanted sort of, although we've been beautifully sent up, the notion of a ceremony has been beautifully sent up, the notion of sort of writing past and futures has been discussed. I just want to say 2 or 3 things. One thing, I mean, it's implicit in everything that's been said, but the discovery that science is a culture, pretty much like any other culture for many purposes, was something that I think was created here and in the small network of people that invented STS. And I remember intensive readings of Kuhn. I mean, I think one of the exercises that you asked students to do, David, and maybe you still do, was to read the structure of scientific revolutions very, very carefully and to make an index of it. The point being, of course, or one of the points being that the book did not have an index, and it was difficult to find. Or at least, anyway. And I think that was incredibly valuable. Detailed, careful reading of Kuhn through a certain kind of philosophical and sociological set of lenses, if one wants to put it in that way, to discover and explicate what it might mean to say that science was or is a culture. And I think that was extremely important. One thing that's not, I think, been mentioned except tangentially is that somehow or other anthropology or bits of anthropology got stirred into the mix. And I distinctly remember Mary Douglas visiting, I think a number of times. And some of David's, some of your most interesting work, David, has been on grid, group, and culture. So I'd really be quite interested. I mean, we don't seem to have time, but I'd be really quite interested to hear the people who were here at the beginning how it was that they engaged with anthropology. Because, well, no, I won't go there. I haven't got time. Second, I think one of the most distinctive things about STS in general, if I might put it in that way, is its commitment to working through the case study. And again, that's been implicit in what's been said, but I just want to spell it out. I've worked in sociology departments for most of my career, and people don't get it. They don't understand how we work. They don't understand how we generate ways of thinking, theories, if that's what you want to call them, through case studies. And I think that's really distinctive. I think it's really, really important. And I think, I mean, it arose in a number of places, that's obvious, but in some considerable measure, it arose here. And I've got a hypothesis, which again I'd be interested to hear David and Barry respond to, which is that it arose out of reading Kuhn carefully. No, I'm serious. I mean, Kuhn's analysis of scientific knowledge takes us to case after case after case, historical cases. And of course, there are, we worked also on contemporary cases, on laboratory ethnographies and all the rest of it. But it's a very distinctive style. And my hypothesis is that it partly came from a careful reading of Kuhn. So that's my second point. Third point is that in a way, I think STS, again, in general, is very much about the study of method. I mean, that follows from Kuhn, it follows from SSK, and it's been articulated in other versions of STS. We've tended to ask how stuff gets done, how stuff gets assembled. I mean, if it's technologies or if it's knowledges. We've looked to see how methods work in practice, and again, that's a rewriting of Kuhn, but I don't think it's a stupid rereading of Kuhn. So, okay, the mechanics of how in my more fevered moments, I tend to think that STS is the exploration of method, and I think that catches something about STS. I hope that catches something about STS, but I think it also catches something about what came out of the Science Studies unit. I could, of course, give you a discourse at this point on material semiotics, actor network theory, and after, but maybe this isn't the moment. I sort of agree. I sort of share Andy's prejudices about that. I mean, for me, I shifted to so-called actor network theory, to say this very briefly, sort of just to try it out. No, I'm quite serious. I went to Paris and I started working with Michel Callon. In 1980, in the attics of the École des Mines de Paris, and there was this thing that didn't have a name. That was about sort of relating things together, and which later became called actor network theory. And we spent 3 months working on fairy tales as cases, just to see what we could make of them. So for me, I knew I was giving up something by giving up SSK. A well-worked-out theory of agency, and a powerful notion of structure, notions like social interest and so on. But I wanted to try something different, and that's the way I went. I think, if I may say so, there are some blind spots, aren't there? We all have blind spots. I can't see my blind spots. But I mean, what would I say about possible Science Studies unit blind spots in my era? I'm not talking about your era. Inequality. Structured inequalities. I mean, this isn't a criticism actually, really, because we, I was part of it, were doing something different. And if people start, complaining that science studies doesn't do inequality, or this version of science studies doesn't do equality, I say, well, look, actually, we were doing something different. It was dead important. But at the same time, they're not exactly wrong in my view. Structured inequalities were not very much on the agenda, and Wendy's alluded to gender, but I think that's the case in other ways. I'm really interested in this relation with politics, because it seems to me you know, and this is to discuss. It's not I don't have a sort of fixed view on this, but it seems to me that Brian sort of caught very well. You caught very well the sort of separating of a set of intellectual inquiries and the creation of a set of tools for thinking about the production or the creation of knowledges, the construction of knowledges, from the wider, I don't really want to use that term, but the wider context that was also political. It's been fascinating to track that over a number of decades, and of course watching people like Brian put those things back together. Situatedness and multiplicity. Well, okay, you can be clever, and you know, and I mean, I learned that from Donna Haraway and feminist semiotics 20 years on. And again, it's not to complain about what was done, but just to note that that wasn't there. I think that's it. I owe so much to the Science Studies Unit and my time here, like I guess everyone else in the room. Thank you.
We're just about out of time. So I asked Robin to drop me as someone doing a talk, because after all, I'm still here in a routine kind of way, whereas there are people who many of you may not have seen before and who are not here in a routine sort of way. So it's much more important that you hear from them rather than hear from me. So all I'm going to do in the light of the time is to say 2 thank yous. The first is, of course, a very personal thank you, especially to the people here in this room who made up the unit at the time in which I joined it. So Barbara, the, of course, sadly absent David Edge, Barry, David, John Law, who taught the first tutorial that I took part in, Carol, you know, the whole lot of the old gang who are still here, and then of course everybody who joined over the years. So that's the personal thank you. The collective thank you is just to all of you for coming along and taking part in this very nice celebration. So thank you all very much.